Hi, my name is Donna Granata. Welcome to Studio A at USC Annenberg. My guest today is a wonderful author by the name of Kevin Wallace. Thanks for being here, Kevin.
Thanks for having me.
Kevin is the executive director of the Beatrice Wood Center for the Arts, which is a hub of incredible activity. And he has had the opportunity to work with many, many artists. And one artist is currently on display at the Craft and Folk Art Museum in Los Angeles, Binh Pho. And Kevin, tell us a little bit about how you got involved in working with Binh.
It started with me writing books, and then my being very much involved with the wood art field. And everyone told me, I'd seen Binh's work, but everybody told me, this guy has a story you have to write. You need to write the book about this guy. And it is a fascinating story, growing up in Vietnam, in Saigon, the fall of Saigon, being there at the American Embassy, almost getting on one of the helicopters, but being left behind, attempting escapes. It's this incredible story. So Binh and I got together finally, and we talked and found we had a lot in common, and it ended up being a book.
Well, and you share a lot of the same philosophies and the sense of destiny as it was written in The Shadow of the Turning, which is the latest book that coincides with this current exhibition at the Craft and Folk Art Museum. So you just lightly touched on Binh's life story, but it is an extraordinary story of tremendous hardship, but yet he has a sense of resolve, acceptance. So talk a little bit about that, how he has this amazing attitude of understanding he wouldn't be where he is today had it not been for these extreme difficulties.
Yes, well, one of the things we had in common, aside from this interest in destiny, was we were both interested in Eastern thought. His mother was a Buddhist, his father, to some extent, studied Taoism. And so when I met Binh, he was reading Lao Tzu every day. And so his philosophy was very much influenced by Taoist thought. So when Binh talks about his life and the things that happened, he'll say, I was so unhappy, I was miserable, this was horrible, this thing that happened. But now he views it all in retrospect, and he sees very clearly how he was destined not to get out when he wanted to get out, how everything was destined to come together and be what it is. And that he realizes they were all steps, that if anything had happened any differently, he wouldn't be where he is today, enjoying the life he's enjoying today.
Well, and we're going to look at some of his incredible artwork and talk a little bit more about him and see the actual work. So I have them all right here queued up, ready to go. We have our first image is a very early piece. So tell everybody about this piece, and boy, has he come a long way from these early works.
Indeed. This was one of the first the series of works that I saw by him, and he was basically documenting different cities in the United States that he had some relationship with, or had either lived in or meant something to him. And so he was already painting these things very vividly, which at the time was not a popular thing in wood turning. Most people just loved the natural wood, and it was considered a horrible, horrible thing to cover up the natural beauty of the wood. The reason for San Francisco is that he ended up meeting his future wife on the boat they finally escaped from, and they ended up on a Malaysian island together, waiting to immigrate, and they fell in love. And once they got to the United States, she went to live with her family in the Bay Area, and he went to live with his family a couple hundred miles away, and they even split up for a while. She thought, oh, this isn't going to work. And he kept trying to win her back. So San Francisco was sort of a very important city in that way.
Oh, beautiful. So this idea of doing the cities and creating these kind of autobiographical pieces, soon he ended up incorporating all the symbolism. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. For instance, this particular work that we're looking at right now is an example of more what people are doing with wood as far as the natural edge and the shape of it and the beauty of the wood. But in this case, he pierced the bamboo forest. And one of his escape attempts, he spent days walking through this bamboo forest, one of the failed attempts. And so the bamboo often shows up in his work. So this is an interesting example because it shows the work without the paint and the natural wood, but yet it's very distinctively who he is.
And also it's important to note that the raw bark is part of this piece. As he was turning it, he left the outer rim of the bark.
Yes, which is very difficult to actually maintain all of that because the bark wants to come off. And also there's the difference between the coloration of the sapwood and the wood. So there's the three variations. There's a bark, there's the two different layers of wood.
So his work slowly became much more involved, much more sophisticated, and he started to create these, as we mentioned, the narrative elements, but then he started to go back to those roots of pigment and coloring the pieces. So this particular piece is quite stunning and has a rather dramatic story.
Yes, it does indeed. It's called The Last Helicopter. And when Binh was growing up in Vietnam, the children, of course, there were these military helicopters always flying overhead, and they called them dragonfly planes because of the way they hovered and buzzed around. So this one actually symbolically depicts the chaos during the fall of Saigon and watching that last helicopter take flight.
Oh. And as we know, he was in the American embassy. He was one of the 423,
Yes,
is that right? People who the military was trying to get out, but of course that final order came. And
yes. And he actually went home and just sat depressed, and everybody's like, well, you know, why aren't you going to the harbor? People are going to the harbor, people are doing everything they could to get out. But he didn't get out. He sort of went back to where he was living. And then there was a series of escape attempts after that. After that, there were different ways of getting out that people were trying. But the communists, of course, knew everybody was trying to get out, so it was very difficult. And so eventually, on one of the escape attempts, he was captured and put in a re-education camp, which is pretty much a prison, until he said, oh, now I see you guys are right. Yes, communism's the way to go. And then they let him go. But then you see, after that, trying to escape, you're in even more trouble, because if you've already gone through the re-education and you then are still trying to escape, then they know that you're lying to them. So
was he captured again?
he wasn't, fortunately. It wouldn't have been good.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, it's a terrible, terrible story. It's very hard for any of us to really relate to it. You know, and now we're in a time where refugees are desperately trying to come to the United States. It seems to be kind of this timeless, well, it's a byproduct of war.
It really is. Yeah. And Rory Kennedy recently did a documentary that Binh was in about the last days of Vietnam that really talked, that was the reason she made it, is to say, this is something we keep doing. We need to stop doing this.
Yeah. And it was a fabulous film.
It was wonderful, yes.
So we have another piece to share with everyone. Talk about this.
On this piece, this is actually made from a burl wood. People that know what a burl is, it's sort of this thing that grows on the side of the tree, which is quite beautiful on the inside, but if you slice into it, it has these beautiful patterns. So what Binh did, this one reflects the life on the island, once he, in that Malaysian island where he fell in love with his wife and impressed his father-in-law by, he figured out that there was a black market going on with cigarettes and candy and things. So he borrowed some money from someone, went and bought 2 big metal popcorn containers, sold the popcorn, used those as flotation devices to swim out to one of the boats that had the black marketing, bought some things, filled them up in the cans, brought them in, and started making money. And so his future father-in-law was like, you know, this is a good man. He's making things work. So he's a very resourceful man.
Very resourceful. So you wrote a recent book,
yes.
And so tell us about the first book, and then let's talk about the second book.
Yes, well, the first book, we wanted to, it was really about his work, all of his works were autobiographical at that point, and so basically his works illustrated the story of his life. So I wrote basically his biography, which was really, as far as Binh's concerned, he's living the American dream.
I'm sure.
Because that's the very reason he wanted out, is to have the very life he has today. And actually, he has more than he could have possibly dreamt of, becoming an artist and really being able to do what he wants to do in life.
That's so beautiful. So the second book is The Shadow of the Turning.
Yes.
So tell us about the title and how this came about.
So we started talking about, well, what if we did a fictional book and you created the works that told the story? And so we came up with a sort of a radical idea. Binh's interesting because his children, basically over that period of years in growing up, he'd watched every fantasy film, every Disney film, every fairy tale, every adventure film. So he had an interesting sense of storytelling in the stories and what he wanted to put in the book. And so for me, on my part, I basically took his life story and his symbolism and just put it on other characters. And the idea, there's a reference to the turning, which of course on one level makes reference to wood turning, which is what he was doing. But we came up with this idea that it was the time of the turning, which is a great shift in society and the planet, and that there was this balance that had to be maintained, which the idea came from Lao Tzu and Taoist thought about this balance and restoring the balance. And so the shadow of the turning was basically that there were shadow characters involved, and then there's the characters that are doing what seems to be right, and sometimes you have to do, you have to find the balance. So you're not necessarily serving the light or the darkness, you're serving the balance.
You had the opportunity to curate an exhibition at the Craft and Folk Art Museum in Los Angeles, but this is not the first exhibition you have curated of Binh's work.
I remember back before the first book even happened, I talked to Binh about maybe doing a show at the Craft and Folk Art Museum. And so it was almost like it was destined, it was already all in the cards. And considering that we came up with such a strange concept, admittedly strange concept for this book, that's a sort of a fantasy adventure novel that's also an exhibition, it's amazing we got a number of museums to take the show, and a lot of them really got it, really understood the ideas, and I'm really happy with the way the Craft and Folk Art Museum reacted to it and the way they pulled it together.
And this is the last stop on this tour.
Yes. It is. It started in the South, it went up through the East Coast and then across the country and ends up in California, which is actually what happens to the characters in the book as well. The book ends with them all coming to Southern California.
We're going to talk about a couple more pieces. Help everyone really understand the artistry behind these works.
Yes, so what Binh does is, first of all, they're turned very thin so that he can then pierce them. And then they're very carefully pierced with, everybody knows, a dental drill. And areas are masked off, and then he does airbrushing. He learned three-dimensional airbrushing techniques. And then so often there's gold leaf involved, there's texturing, there's pyrography. In recent works there's glass. He had this idea for casting the works in glass, and the guy said that's impossible. But they worked at it, and Binh was an assistant, and they figured it out.
And it adds a whole nother dimension to the work.
It really does. It's amazing, and he's amazed a lot of people in the glass world in doing that.
We have some examples of pieces that actually open.
Yes, well,
right?
in the craft field, whether you're talking about glass blowing or people throwing pots on a wheel or turning wood, the vessel is a very popular item. So vessels are run through it, but then the idea is, well, how do you take a vessel and really open it up and make it more? And in the case of this particular work, it's actually opened up, almost like a book, and where he's able to use the interior and the exterior. And then quite often he takes pieces like this and actually they can be put together in different ways, so they're interactive in a sense.
Well, they are exquisite and very unconventional in the sense of wood turning.
He is. He's really in the world of fine art and working with mixed media now. So for somebody to say he's simply a wood turner, they'd be wrong.
The Craft and Folk Art Museum in Los Angeles, the exhibition will be up through January 3rd. I appreciate you coming in so much, Kevin. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for helping me share this story.
That's all we have time for. Thanks for joining us. And again, I'm Donna Granata. Thank you for taking the time to see the program. Thank you.